I'm over 50 and I realize my entire life has been nothing but hard work, debt, and the feeling of failure. I want to start with something that most people my age don't say out loud, not at the dinner table, not at work, not even to the people closest to them. I want to start with the word that lives in the back of my chest, like something I swallowed a long time ago and never fully digested. The word is failure. I am 52 years old, and for most of my adult life, underneath everything, underneath the showing up and the working and the trying and the surviving, there has been this quiet, persistent, unshakable feeling that I have failed. Not at one specific thing. Not at one moment I can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. At everything. At the whole thing. At the project of building a life that looks and feels like something I intended, something I chose, something that reflects what I am capable of, rather than simply what I was able to endure. That feeling, the feeling of failure, is what I want to talk about today, because I think it's one of the most common feelings in the world and one of the least spoken about, and the silence around it is doing damage that I don't think we fully understand. I am 52 years old. I have worked since I was a child, practically. Not in the sense that anyone put me to work before I was ready, but in the sense that the circumstances of my family meant that contributing wasn't a choice. It was a necessity that arrived early and never really left. I grew up watching my parents work themselves to exhaustion for wages that were never quite enough. I grew up understanding, without anyone having to explain it to me explicitly, that in our world, in our particular corner of this country, you worked because you had to, and you hoped that the working would be enough, and sometimes it was, and sometimes it wasn't, and either way you showed up again the next morning because there was no other option available. That understanding was my inheritance. Not money, not property, not connections, not education beyond what was strictly required. The understanding that you work, you survive, and you keep going. I got my first job at 14, informal, cash in hand, nothing that went on any record. I swept floors, I moved boxes, I did whatever needed doing for whoever was willing to pay a kid to do it. At 16, I had my first official job, the kind with a time card and a paycheck, and taxes taken out before you ever see the money. I remember the first time I held that paycheck and felt the specific bitterness of seeing how much had been taken before it reached me. I was 16 years old and already learning that the money you earn and the money you keep are two very different numbers. I spent the next 36 years learning variations of that same lesson. I never went to college. I want to be honest about why, because the easy answer and the true answer are not quite the same. The easy answer is that we couldn't afford it, which is true. The true answer is more complicated. The true answer is that college was so far outside the visible horizon of my daily reality that it never seriously presented itself as an option I needed to think through and reject. It was more like it existed in the same category as certain other things, things that were clearly available in the world, but not available in my world specifically. Other people went to college. Other kinds of people in other kinds of families with other kinds of trajectories. I went to work. That was the path that was available to me, and I took it not with resignation exactly, but with the practical acceptance of someone who has learned early that the distance between what you want and what is available to you is a distance. You learn to stop measuring, because measuring it only produces a pain you can't do anything useful with. The jobs I took over the years were the jobs available to someone with my education and my background and my specific position in the economic order of things. They were physical jobs mostly, jobs that required your body more than your credentials, jobs where you earned your wages in a way you could feel in your back and your knees at the end of the shift. I am not ashamed of those jobs. I want to be clear about that. There is nothing wrong with physical work, nothing undignified about it, nothing that should carry any mark of failure. I did those jobs well. I showed up reliably, I worked hard. I was the kind of employee that supervisors appreciated because I never had to be told twice and I never created problems. I gave everything I had to every job I ever held, and I mean that without any exaggeration. But those jobs had a ceiling that I hit early and never got past. A wage ceiling, a growth ceiling, a possibility ceiling. The raises were small when they came at all. The benefits were minimal or non-existent. The retirement plans, if they existed at all, were modest things that assumed a consistent contribution over decades, which sounds achievable, until you understand that contributing consistently to anything requires a surplus, and a surplus was something I almost never had. Month after month, year after year, decade after decade, what I earned was almost exactly what I needed to survive, not what I needed to get ahead, just what I needed to keep going. And keeping going, I have learned, is not the same as moving forward. I want to tell you about debt, because debt is the other character in this story, and it deserves to be named properly. Debt entered my life in my early 20s, and it never left. Not the same debt. The debt changed shape over the years, transformed from one form into another, got paid down in one place and accumulated in another, shifted from credit cards to personal loans to medical bills, to the kind of informal borrowing that happens between people when there's no other option left. But it was always there, always present, always exerting its particular gravity on every financial decision I made, which is to say on every decision I made, because when you don't have money, everything is a financial decision. The thing about debt that people who have never lived inside it chronically don't fully understand is what it does to your relationship with time. Debt collapses your time horizon. When you are in debt, when you are always in debt, your entire financial existence takes place in the very short term. You think about this month's payment, this week's bill, today's balance. The long term becomes almost inaccessible as a real concept because the short term is so pressing, so urgent, so immediately consequential that your brain simply cannot afford to spend much energy on something as abstract as 20 years from now, and so you don't plan for 20 years from now. Not because you don't want to, not because you don't understand that you should, but because the cognitive and emotional resources required for that kind of planning are resources that the immediate crisis has already claimed. You are putting out fires. You do not have the bandwidth to also be an architect. I remember the moment I want to tell you about most clearly. It was not a single dramatic event. It was a Wednesday evening about 4 years ago, the kind of evening that should have been unremarkable, that should have been just another evening in a long succession of them. I had gotten home from work, which was then a warehouse job, third shift, the kind of work that leaves you tired in a way that sleep doesn't fully fix. I had picked up some groceries on the way home, the kind of careful grocery shopping where you know exactly what you can spend, and you navigate the store with that number in your head, like a compass, putting things back when the total starts creeping toward the limit. I had gotten home, put the groceries away and sat down at the kitchen table with the small pile of mail that had accumulated over the previous few days because I had been too tired when I got home from work to deal with it. I went through the mail the way I always went through it, which was slowly and with a specific kind of dread that I had normalized so thoroughly I barely recognized it as dread anymore. It had become just a feeling, just the particular quality of attention I brought to envelopes. A bill I had been expecting, a bill I had not been expecting, a notice from a creditor about an account I thought I had resolved 2 months earlier, but apparently had not. And then at the bottom of the pile a birthday card, from my daughter. She was living across the country by then, had moved there for a job opportunity, and we talked when we could, but the distance was real in more ways than one. The card was simple. She had drawn something on the inside, a small drawing of the two of us the way she used to draw when she was little, and she had written a message that I won't repeat in full because some things are private, but part of what she wrote was that she hoped I knew how proud she was of me, and how hard she knew I had worked my whole life and how much she loved me. I sat at that kitchen table, with the creditor notice on one side and my daughter's birthday card on the other, and something broke open in me that I had been holding shut for a very long time. Not loudly. I am not a person who breaks loudly. But something gave way, because in that moment, holding those 2 pieces of paper, I could see my whole life in a kind of terrible clarity that I usually managed to avoid. On one side, 40 years of work producing a creditor notice. On the other side, a daughter who loved me and was proud of me, and who had no idea, or maybe some idea, how hollow that pride landed in me in that moment. Because the pride she felt was for the effort, and I had put in the effort. Genuinely, completely, without reservation. And the effort had produced a creditor notice, and an empty bank account, and no savings and no plan, and a tiredness that lived in my bones, and a question that I could no longer avoid, which was, what was it all for? I sat with that question for a long time that night. I didn't answer it. I'm not sure I have answered it fully even now, but I stopped avoiding it, which is its own kind of progress. Let me talk about the feeling of failure specifically, because I think it's important to be precise about what I mean when I use that word. I am not talking about a feeling that I made one specific mistake, one wrong turn, one decision that I could identify and point to and think, if I had done that differently, everything would be different. That kind of failure is almost easier to carry because it has a shape, a location, a cause and effect that makes narrative sense. What I am talking about is something more diffuse and more relentless than that. It is the feeling that the whole project has not worked, that the sum of all the efforts, all the years, all the showing up and working hard and trying and surviving, when you add it all together and look at what it has produced, the total does not correspond to what you were implicitly promised it would produce. And that gap between the promise and the reality is where the feeling of failure lives. The promise was never made explicitly. Nobody sat me down and said, work hard and you will have security. Work hard and you will own a home. Work hard and you will be able to retire at a reasonable age. The promise was made culturally, atmospherically, through the stories we tell and the values we celebrate, and the version of the American experience that gets held up as the standard against which individual lives are measured. Work hard, be responsible, keep at it, and the system will reward you. That is the promise, and it is a promise that for a very specific segment of the working population, the people who started with less, who had access to less, who worked the kinds of jobs that the economy needs but does not generously reward, that promise has not been kept. I want to be careful here, because I know that some people will hear this and think, he's making excuses. He's blaming the system for his own choices. And I want to engage with that honestly, because I think it deserves an honest engagement rather than a defensive one. There are things I could have done differently. There are choices, looking back, that I can see more clearly now than I could see them in the moment, that might have produced different outcomes. I could have been more aggressive about finding ways to educate myself, even without formal schooling. I could have been more disciplined about money in my 20s, when the habits that would define the following decades were being formed. I could have asked for help at moments when I was too proud or too ashamed to ask. I could have made different choices about credit, about debt, about the particular way I responded to financial pressure, which was mostly to push it to the back of my awareness and keep working, and hope that the working would eventually outpace the problem. Those are real things, I own them. They are part of the story, but they are not the whole story. And when the whole story includes wages that did not keep pace with the cost of living for decades, a healthcare system that turns illness into financial catastrophe for people without good insurance, a housing market that has made ownership inaccessible for a growing portion of the working population, a credit system that charges the most to the people who can least afford it, a retirement system that has shifted the burden and the risk entirely onto individuals without giving those individuals the financial education or the surplus income required to meet that burden. When the whole story includes all of that, then the individual choices are real, but they are not the only thing that matters. Both things are true. I made choices that contributed to where I am, and I operated within a system that made a certain outcome very difficult to avoid, regardless of those choices. Both things are true, and both things need to be held. What I have struggled with most, though, is not assigning blame. Blame is actually the easier part, the part that has the clearest emotional logic to it, the part that gives you somewhere to put the feeling so it doesn't just sit in your chest without an address. What I have struggled with most is meaning, is the question of what it means to have worked this hard for this long and arrived at this place. Because if the work was supposed to lead somewhere and it didn't, then what was the work? If the sacrifice, and there was sacrifice, real sacrifice, years of things foregone and pleasures deferred and rest denied, if all of that sacrifice was supposed to accumulate into something and it hasn't, then what does that say? What story do you tell yourself about your own life when the story you were given to tell doesn't match the life you've actually lived? That is the question I have been sitting with for years, and I do not have a clean answer. What I have is something more provisional and more honest than a clean answer. What I have is the gradual, difficult, ongoing process of separating the value of a life from its financial outcomes, of understanding, not just intellectually but in the actual felt experience of my daily existence, that the worth of what I have done and who I have been is not fully captured in my bank balance or my absence of assets or the stubborn persistence of debt. That my daughter drawing the two of us the way she did when she was little and writing that she was proud of me was not nothing. That the relationships I have maintained through decades of difficulty, the people who know me and have stuck by me and whose lives I have been a presence in and who have been presences in mine, that none of that is nothing. That showing up, for decades, through exhaustion and discouragement and the grinding repetitiveness of survival, is not nothing. But I also have to be honest and say that this understanding, when I can access it, does not make the practical reality of my situation disappear. I still do not have savings. I still do not own a home. Retirement is still an abstraction that I do not have a clear path to. These are real things with real consequences for how I will live the remaining decades of my life. And the emotional or philosophical reframe, as genuinely useful as it is, does not pay a bill or create a safety net that doesn't exist. Both the reframe and the practical reality need to be engaged with. And for most of my life, I have been engaging with neither very effectively, which is part of how I got here. Let me talk about shame, because shame is what keeps most of this underground. Shame is why people like me, people in situations like mine, don't talk about it. Don't tell their stories. Don't reach out for help. Don't examine their circumstances with honesty, because honesty requires looking at something they have learned to associate with their own inadequacy. The shame of financial struggle is a very specific kind of shame. It is not the shame of a single act, not the shame of a moment you can apologize for and move past. It is the shame of a condition, of a persistent state of being, of a reality that follows you everywhere you go and that you have to actively manage so that other people don't see it. I have been managing that for decades. The specific calculations involved in appearing more financially stable than you are. Not lying exactly, but not being fully transparent either. Finding the right level of vagueness when money comes up in conversation. Declining invitations without explaining the real reason. Smiling when colleagues talk about their retirement plans and their investment accounts and their home equity. Smiling and nodding and contributing just enough to seem like you belong in the conversation, while inside you are doing the math on whether you can make it to the end of the month without calling in a favor. You will feel terrible about calling in. I have become expert at this performance. I have been performing it for so long that sometimes I forget I am performing it, which is the most dangerous stage of any performance, the stage where the performance starts to feel like identity. Because that is what shame does over time. It doesn't just make you hide the thing you're ashamed of, it makes you start to become the hiding. You organize your entire self-presentation around the concealment, and eventually the concealment starts to feel like who you are. The person who is always a little evasive about money. The person who changes the subject when finances come up. The person who shows up but keeps a certain distance, a certain careful distance that keeps people from getting close enough to see the thing you don't want them to see. And that distance, necessary as it feels, has a cost. It costs you the kind of connection that might actually help. It costs you the advice you might receive if you were honest. It costs you the simple relief of being fully known by another person without the performance in the way. I want to talk about work. Not just the fact of working, but the experience of it. What it has felt like to spend the majority of my waking hours, for the majority of my adult life, doing physically demanding, often repetitive, often undervalued labor. Because I think there is something important that gets lost when we talk about working-class people and work. We often talk about the economic aspect, the wages and the conditions and the lack of advancement. We talk less about the psychological aspect, about what it does to a person to spend their days in work that does not reflect the full range of what they are capable of, work that does not see them as a whole person, work that requires their physical presence and their physical output, but is largely indifferent to anything else they might have to offer. I am not a simple person. I know that might sound like a strange thing to say, but I say it because I think the jobs I have held over my life sometimes made me feel like one, like a function, like a unit of output. I think, I observe. I have opinions about things that have nothing to do with warehouse logistics or whatever the current job happened to be. I have read when I have had the energy, which has not always been as often as I would have liked. I have thoughts about the world and about people, and about what matters and why. None of that ever had much relevance to the work. The work needed my back and my hands, and my reliability. It did not particularly need or want the rest of me. And spending the majority of your hours in a context that only wants part of you, over decades, produces a particular kind of tiredness that is not just physical. That tiredness is part of what I mean when I talk about failure. Not just the financial failure, the absence of savings and security and all of that, but the tiredness of a person who has given so much of themselves for so long and feels, looking at the result, that the giving was not adequately received, that the transaction was not fair, that what was taken out and what was put back in were not equal, and the deficit has accumulated in a way that I can feel in my body and in my spirit, in a way that is harder to articulate than a bank balance, but just as real. I turned 52 recently. Not recently in a way that felt like a celebration, though the people who love me tried to make it one. More recently in a way that felt like a reckoning. Because 52 has a particular quality to it that earlier milestone birthdays did not. At 40, I still had the sense, faint but present, that there was time enough ahead to change the trajectory. At 50, that sense was fainter, but still there. At 52, something about the arithmetic started to feel different. The working years remaining, the years available for whatever change I might still be capable of making, felt for the first time like a finite and not particularly generous number. And looking at that number from where I am, without savings, without assets, without a clear plan for what comes after the working stops, was a sobering experience that I am still in the middle of processing. I want to say something about the people who will watch this video and recognize their own story in it. I want to say something to them specifically, not to the people who are comfortable and secure and watching out of curiosity or compassion, but to the people for whom this lands as recognition, as the articulation of something they have been carrying without the words for it. I want to say I see you, not in a sentimental way, in a specific way. I see the calculation you do before you agree to anything that costs money. I see the performance you maintain at work, and with friends and at family gatherings. I see the way you redirect conversations that get too close to the truth of your financial situation. I see the specific fatigue of a person who is always managing the gap between what they are and what they feel they are supposed to be. I see it because I live it, and I want you to know that the shame you feel about it is not a fair verdict. It is a response to a story you were told and a standard you were given that was not designed with your actual circumstances in mind. The narrative of financial failure as personal failure is one of the most effective and most damaging stories this culture tells. It is effective because it contains enough truth to be credible. Choices do matter. Behavior does matter. Individual decisions over a lifetime do accumulate into outcomes that are at least partially shaped by those decisions. All of that is true. But the narrative becomes damaging when it stops there, when it treats individual choice as the only variable, when it ignores the structural conditions that made certain choices easier or harder, when it uses financial outcome as the primary measure of a person's worth and effort and integrity. That version of the story is not complete. And living inside an incomplete story for long enough starts to feel like living inside a lie, which is exhausting in a way that compounds everything else. I am starting, slowly and imperfectly, to tell myself a different story. Not a story that denies the reality of my financial situation. Not a story that pretends the struggle hasn't been real or that the consequences of where I am aren't serious. But a story that is more complete, a story that holds the work I have done and the life I have lived and the people I have loved and who have loved me in the same frame as the bank balance and the absence of savings and the persistent debt. A story where those things coexist without one cancelling out the other. A story where I am not defined by what I do not have, even while I am honest about not having it. That shift is harder than it sounds. It goes against decades of internalized messaging. It goes against the way I was taught to measure things, the way I learned to evaluate my own worth. The automatic equation that runs in my head between what I have accumulated financially and what I deserve to feel about myself. Changing that equation is not a one-time act. It is a daily practice, and some days I am better at it than others. Some days the story I tell myself is generous and honest and complete. Other days I open a bill and the old verdict rushes back in before I can stop it. The verdict that says, "Look, here is the proof, here is the evidence, here is what all that working produced." And on those days I have to work to remember that the bill is not the whole story. It is a piece of the story, an important piece with real consequences, but not the whole thing. Let me talk about what I'm actually doing practically, because I think it would be dishonest to spend all of this time on the emotional and psychological landscape without acknowledging the concrete reality that something needs to change, not just in how I feel about my situation, but in the situation itself. Because feeling better about a problem and solving a problem are related, but not the same. And I have spent too much of my life in the feeling better without the solving. What I am doing practically is small. I want to be honest about that. It is not dramatic. It does not make a compelling story about financial transformation. What I am doing is this. I have started looking at my money with more honesty and more regularity than I have ever looked at it before. Every month I sit down, before the month starts, and I write down what is coming in and what is going out. Not in a complicated spreadsheet, on a piece of paper. And I look at it. I let myself see it clearly, without the habitual blurring that I have used for years to make the picture more bearable. And from that clear view, I make decisions, small ones. Which payment to prioritize, where there is any flexibility at all, however small, and where there isn't. What the month actually looks like rather than the vague, uncomfortable, deliberately imprecise version of it that I usually carried around. This sounds like nothing. I know it sounds like nothing. But for a person who spent decades avoiding that clear view because the clear view hurt too much, sitting down and looking, actually looking, is not nothing. It is a form of courage that doesn't get celebrated because it doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like a middle-aged man with a piece of paper, but from the inside it is the decision to stop hiding from my own life. And that decision, maintained consistently, has started to produce results. Not dramatic results. Not results that would impress anyone who hasn't been living where I have been living. But I know where my money goes now. I have started to find, in the honest-looking, small amounts that I had been spending automatically and unconsciously, amounts that when redirected consistently begin to represent something. Not a retirement fund, but a beginning, a direction. I have also started to ask for help. This is the harder thing. This is the thing that the shame fought hardest against. Because asking for help means admitting that you need it, which means admitting that you don't have it handled, which means admitting the thing you have spent decades carefully not admitting to anyone whose opinion of you care about. I asked for help from someone I trust, not a financial professional. I cannot afford a financial professional, a friend who has been in a difficult situation himself and found some ways through it. I told him the truth. I told him the numbers. I sat in the discomfort of being fully seen in my financial reality by another person, and I waited to see what happened. What happened was that he did not think less of me. What happened was that he shared things he knew that I didn't know. What happened was that the conversation was useful in a practical way, and also in a way that had nothing to do with practical, which was the simple and profound relief of not carrying it entirely alone anymore. That relief. I want to talk about that relief specifically because I think it is underestimated as a resource. The weight of carrying a financial struggle in silence, of maintaining the performance, of never setting the thing down and letting another person help you hold it, is a weight that accumulates interest the same way debt does. It gets heavier over time. It demands more and more of you. And when you finally set it down, even just for a conversation, even just partially, what you get back is not a solution. You get back energy, attention, the cognitive and emotional space that the secret was occupying, space that can now be used for something other than maintaining the secret. And that space, it turns out, is where the possibility of change actually lives. I want to say something about the future that is honest, rather than either hopeless or falsely optimistic. The honest version is this. I do not know exactly what the next 15 or 20 years look like for me financially. I do not have a plan that resolves everything. I have a direction, which is more than I had a year ago. I have a set of small, consistent practices, which is more than I had 2 years ago. I have a growing willingness to look clearly at my situation, which is more than I had for most of my adult life. These things are real. They are not sufficient. But they are real and they are a beginning. And I have learned at 52 that beginning is not nothing. The retirement question is the one that keeps me up some nights. Not all nights, but some. Because the math on retirement when you are 52 and have no savings is not an easy math. It requires a combination of things, working longer than I might otherwise want to, saving whatever I can from here forward however small, reducing my cost of living in every honest way available to me, and making peace with a version of later life that may not match the version I once imagined. That last one is actually more possible than it sounds, because the version I imagined when I was younger was a version someone else gave me, a cultural image of retirement that involved comfort and security and leisure, and I'm not sure that image was ever really mine, was ever really built on what I actually value rather than on what I was told to value. When I think about what I actually need, the real list is shorter and more achievable than the cultural image suggested. I want to say one more thing about the word failure before I close, because I started with it, and I think I need to end with it honestly, rather than wrapping it in something more comfortable. I have spent most of my life feeling like a failure, and I am not going to tell you that I have stopped feeling that way entirely because I haven't. The feeling still comes. It comes when I look at certain numbers, and when I have certain conversations, and when I let the comparison to where I thought I would be at this age run for too long. It comes. But what has changed is what I do with it when it comes. I used to let it be the verdict. I used to receive it as the final word on who I am and what my life means. Now I receive it as a feeling, not the truth. A feeling. A feeling that was taught to me by a culture that had a very specific and very narrow definition of success, and that applied that definition without regard for the full complexity of what a life is, and what it requires, and what it produces that the definition doesn't capture. A feeling is not a verdict. A feeling is information, and like all information, it needs to be interpreted in context. And the context of my life, the full context, is not a story of failure. It is a story of a person who started with very little and worked very hard under conditions that were genuinely difficult, and made some choices that were not optimal, and lived inside a system that did not return fairly on the investment of his labor, and arrived at 52 with less than he should have, and more than he sometimes gives himself credit for. That is the honest story, not the redemption arc version, not the failure verdict version. The honest, complicated, still being written, not yet finished version. I am 52 years old. I am still here. I am still showing up. I am, for the first time in a long time, showing up with my eyes open rather than managing the view. And that is not everything. But it is not nothing, and not nothing at this point in my life after all of this is enough to keep going, which is what I intend to do. If you are living a version of this story, if you recognized yourself in any part of what I said, I want you to sit for a moment with this. You are not the verdict your bank account tries to pass on you. You are not the sum of your debt, or the absence of your savings, or the distance between where you are and where you thought you would be. You are someone who has been working hard inside conditions that were harder than they should have been, doing the best you knew how to do with what you had, and still going. That is not failure. That is something closer to the opposite of failure, even when it doesn't feel that way. Even when the feeling is exactly the one I described at the beginning of this. Even then. The story is not over. It is in a hard chapter, maybe one of the hardest, but it is not the last chapter. And in the chapters still to come, you have more agency than the feeling of failure wants you to believe. Not unlimited agency. Not the power to undo everything that came before, but real agency, real choices, real possibility. Start with one honest look. Start with one piece of paper and one pen and the decision to stop blurring the picture. Start there. Everything else that is possible starts there, That is what I know. That is what I have. And for today, for right now, that is enough.